On the 7th of January 1610, Galileo Galilei took a telescope he had built and turned it towards the night sky. Soon he was looking at 3 of the moons of the planet Jupiter. Fresh discoveries ensued in the months after this, including observations of Saturn and Venus. With these discoveries, Galileo transformed our understanding of the solar system. But it came at a cost. 23 years later, he was investigated by the Roman Inquisition and forced to recant some of his views. How did this great man go from stargazer to persecuted scientist? This is the story of Galileo and the birth of the scientific revolution. The man known to history as Galileo Galilei was born on the 15th of February 1564 in the city of Pisa in the Duchy of Florence, what would become the Grand Duchy of Tuscany just a few years later in 1569. His full name was Galileo di Vincenzo Buonaiuti de Galilei. Galileo's father was Vincenzo Galilei, a lutenist and composer who originally hailed from the village of Santa Maria a Monte, not far from Pisa. He began playing the lute at a young age, and eventually reached the stage where he could make a living from it. He was never a wealthy composer though, and he spent much of his career traveling around Italy as a semi-itinerant player at the courts of the various Italian city-states and duchies in order to make a substantial enough living. In 1562, he had married Giulia Amanati, the daughter of a merchant whose family were noted scholars and business people in Tuscany. An ancestor, Jacopo Amanati, had, for instance, been a secretary to Pope Pius II, head of the Roman Catholic Church between 1458 and 1464. Hence, Galileo came from intellectually and culturally distinguished families on both sides. His name itself, Galileo, was taken from an ancestor who, in the early 15th century, had been a doctor and politician in Florence in the days of the Republic, when the influence of the Medici banking family over the city was only starting to be established. Galileo was the first of 6 children that Vincenzo and Giulia had. 2 of them died in infancy. The most significant of his sibling relationships was with his younger brother Michelagnolo. Like their father, Michelagnolo would become a lutenist and musician. He also struggled financially and would come to rely on Galileo for money in ways which impacted on Galileo's own life and career. The Galilei family lived in Pisa during Galileo's earliest years. Their family life was shaped by Vincenzo's career and financial struggles, and he was a frequently absent father. While Giulia was pregnant with Galileo, for example, Vincenzo was away from Pisa to engage with Gioseffo Zarlino, an acclaimed musical theorist of the 16th century. On different occasions, he found himself in cities like Venice and Florence. Despite being an accomplished musician, Vincenzo struggled to acquire enough money to allow the family to live in the manner that he wanted to, and they sometimes relied on money from Giulia's father in addition to the substantial dowry which she had brought to the marriage. While his father was away, Galileo began his education in Pisa. In the early 1570s, the family moved to Florence, where Vincenzo had acquired more stable patronage amongst the city's nobles and merchants. Galileo was left behind for a time to complete his early tutoring, meaning that he always retained a close connection to Pisa. From the mid-1570s onwards, his education became more varied, and he spent time in Florence with the rest of his family at the Benedictine Abbey at Vallombrosa, south of Florence. This set the pattern for Galileo's position in the family. He was often away from his younger siblings, and after their father's death in 1591, he took on the role of supporting them financially too. Galileo's life and work cannot be assessed without examining the broader historical and intellectual context in which he was living in early modern Europe. The history of science goes all the way back to ancient times, when skilled scientists, whose names are largely unknown, worked out complicated systems of mathematics and astronomy through observation of the stars in places like Egypt and Babylon. This work was underway during the Bronze Age between 5,000 and 3,500 years ago. 1,000 years later, there was a fresh explosion of scientific study by natural philosophers and other scientists from the 7th century BC onwards in places like the city of Miletus, in what is now western Turkey, in Athens in Greece, in Syracuse in Italy, and above all in Alexandria in Egypt, the greatest center of scientific study in the ancient world. Here and elsewhere, great Greek scientists like Euclid, Pythagoras, and Archimedes had worked out much of the fundamental building blocks of subjects like mathematics, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. Then came the collapse of the Roman Empire, and much of the wisdom of the ancient world was lost, though Arab scholars in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, and Greek scholars in Constantinople did much to preserve it, while Western Europe experienced a regression in scientific knowledge. This situation shifted again from around the 12th century onwards. But it was really with the advent of Renaissance humanist scholarship in the 14th century and the rediscovery of the works of the ancient Greeks in places like Italy and Germany that the scientific revolution slowly began in early modern Europe. A fair degree of this was also related to practical circumstances. For instance, rediscovery of geographical knowledge and ways of measuring the world and assessing the scientific elements of it were related to the age of exploration that commenced in the 15th century as navigators from Portugal, Spain, and Italy sought to find new lands by sailing west and south from Europe's Atlantic shores. There is one text above all that defines the commencement of the scientific revolution. In 1543, a Polish scholar by the name of Nicholas Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, meaning On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. This transformative work of scientific analysis outlined the heliocentric theory of the universe, the idea that everything in the solar system, including the Earth, spins around the Sun. This notion fundamentally challenged the accepted wisdom of all Christian thought, the dogma that because humans were created by God and placed on Earth, Earth, by extension, must be the center of the universe, not the Sun. As we will see, Copernicus's work would be central to Galileo's life and career. With the advent of the heliocentric Copernican revolution, a whole new generation of scientists, or natural philosophers, as they termed themselves in early modern times, emerged in the second half of the 16th century. Figures like Tycho Brahe in Denmark, John Dee in England, and Johannes Kepler in Germany. They began studying astronomy, mathematics, and physics in new ways, and making remarkable new discoveries. Galileo would be amongst this earlier wave of natural philosophers, though it really peaked as the 17th century went on and the modern fields of biology and chemistry also emerged through the works of figures like William Harvey and Robert Boyle in England, while the Frenchman René Descartes became the greatest articulator of scientific rationalism. Soon the scientific revolution would begin to transform society in practical ways that were major precursors to the Industrial Revolution and the advent of our modern technological society. Owing to his education at the Benedictine Abbey at Vallombrosa and other influences, Galileo gave serious thought in his youth to joining the clergy, a common calling for middle-class Italians during the early modern era. More broadly, his family had close ties to the church. something which is hard to reconcile with his later ideological clashes with the papacy and the Inquisition. It was his rationality and the scientifically minded elements of his personality which instead led him to pursue an academic career. Already by 1580, when he was only 16 years old, he was studying medicine at the University of Pisa. Medicine was not for him. Instead, he acquired a growing interest in the physical world and how it functioned. Galileo was fascinated by the way objects moved through the air at different speeds and in different ways, and wanted to know why this was the case. It wasn't that nobody had asked these questions before. It was simply that the answers to such questions in late medieval and early modern times were invariably said to lie in the frequently dull and dense arguments of scholastic thinkers like John Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas, who in the High Middle Ages had produced quasi-rationalist yet also quasi-theological answers to such questions. Galileo wanted to come up with better explanations for such phenomena. Thus, while he was studying at Pisa, he began experimenting with pendulums and weights to determine why things moved in the way they did. This was clearly driving him in the direction of becoming a natural philosopher who focused on the fields of mathematics and physics, even though his tutors at Pisa encouraged him to continue studying medicine, a pursuit which was more financially lucrative at the time, when life was precarious and rich people were willing to pay good money to anyone who could potentially extend their time on Earth. In the end, Galileo could not be dissuaded from his decision to focus on mathematics and the emergent field of physics. He never completed his medical degree at Pisa, and instead began studying mathematics in greater depth under Ostilio Ricci, a mathematician who was employed by the Accademia del Disegno that had been set up in Florence under the patronage of Duke Cosimo I de' Medici in 1563. This led to Galileo spending a period of time as a tutor himself, working for clients in Florence and Siena. He met and corresponded with other mathematicians in Tuscany and Italy, like Christoph Clavius. This was a truly pioneering era, when the study of the subject was coming into its own in a way that had not been seen since the work of the Greek scholars of Alexandria in ancient times, or the Arab scholars of Baghdad and Cordoba in the Middle Ages. It was simultaneously a precarious time too for a mathematician, and Galileo sidelined teaching on elements of what the Florentines called disegno, design, which was essentially the scientific elements of painting. For instance, in Florence, he taught painters how to improve the sense of perspective in their works by keeping things in the foreground and background in mathematical proportion to one another. Through the second half of the 1580s, he was applying for a more stable position teaching mathematics at various universities in northern and central Italy. Bologna, the oldest university in the world, rejected him in 1588, but a year later he was appointed as a lecturer in mathematics back in his hometown of Pisa. He would remain here for the next 3 years. At Pisa, between 1589 and 1592, Galileo is famously said to have carried out experiments on weights, speed and gravity at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower is a freestanding bell tower which had first been built in the city in the 12th century and which was completed in the 14th century. It stands 56 meters high and has acquired its leaning appearance owing to the soft soil beneath providing an unstable foundation for the roughly 14,500-ton tower. Although it is the most famous, the Leaning Tower of Pisa is just one of several leaning towers built in Europe during the High Middle Ages. The two towers of Bologna, for instance, feature one tower with a substantial lean. Galileo was ultimately interested in the height of the bell tower of Pisa rather than its poor structural elements. During his time lecturing in mathematics at Pisa, he is understood to have experimented with mass, gravity, and speed by dropping different-sized cannonballs from the top of the Leaning Tower to demonstrate that they did not descend at speeds that were determined exclusively by their mass or weight. This was a thought experiment of sorts, but it has significance for the early study of gravity. What Galileo was effectively demonstrating was that what mattered when it came to falling objects was gravity, not the weight or mass of an object, although the word gravity itself was not applied in this way at the time. In any event, it is possible that the entire story is spurious. Our main evidence for it comes from a life of Galileo written by one of his students in the middle of the 17th century, and it might well simply be a colourful anecdote that was made up. There is no contemporary account to substantiate it. Galileo might have remained at Pisa for the remainder of his working life if he had not received a better offer in 1592 from the University of Padua in the territory of the Republic of Venice to take up the chair or professorship of mathematics there. It was an offer he could not refuse, and he would spend the next 18 years at Padua, a period of his life in which he carried out some of the most revolutionary research, and which he later recalled as the happiest part of his life. That he was content was as much to do with his personal affairs as his working life. Galileo never married, but he did form a long-term relationship and had children. This was with a woman named Marina Gamba. Galileo would frequently visit Venice during his time at Padua, and during one of these trips he met Marina. She eventually came to live with him at Padua, and they had 3 children together: a daughter named Virginia, who was born in 1600, a second daughter named Livia, born a year later in 1601, and a son named Vincenzo, after Galileo's grandfather. All 3 survived infancy. Both Virginia and Livia became nuns at the San Matteo convent in Florence after Galileo relocated to the city in 1610. Vincenzo became a musician, playing the lute for a living, like his uncle and grandfather. Indeed, Galileo was himself a keen lutenist, one of his several hobbies beyond his mathematical and scientific work. Galileo's relationship with his children was loving yet complex, a product of his never having married their mother. The reasons for this are multifaceted. Firstly, Gamba was below Galileo's social status in a time when such things mattered greatly. Secondly, there was a tradition of university faculty remaining unmarried in Italy, which went back to medieval times when many lecturers were churchmen. Thirdly, their children were born out of wedlock, and Galileo seems to have decided not to marry to avoid any scandal concerning this. For all these reasons, he and Marina never married, and their children were illegitimate, at least initially. As the story of his experiments at the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa demonstrate, Galileo had already started to work on the subject of motion, mass, and gravity in his 20s. In Padua, he continued his work, and it was his primary preoccupation for many years. This is clearly demonstrated through the titles of his earliest books. His first was entitled La Bilancetta, meaning the balance, and was a short treatise on the subject of hydrostatic balance and mass. This was, in essence, a commentary on the work of the 3rd century BC Greek scientist Archimedes. Galileo had written and published it in 1586 when he was still a jobbing tutor of 22 years of age. At Pisa, he had published another book on mechanics entitled On Motion, while at Padua he followed up with 2 works entitled Le Meccaniche, or Mechanics, and Le Operazioni del Compasso Geometrico e Militare, the operations of geometrical and military compass. These early works had demonstrated his willingness to question received wisdom, no matter where it came from. In On Motion, he had critiqued the ancient Greek polymath Aristotle's views on the elements and the composition of the physical world. This was at a time when Aristotle still had a quasi-godlike status in Europe's universities, with most of his views accepted unquestioningly. Then the focus of his work started to shift, and he began looking up at the stars. In the 1600s, he began making observations of supernovas and reading the work of Copernicus, Brahe, and Kepler in greater detail. Then, in 1609, he manufactured his own telescope of a very high magnitude and turned it to the sky. Our understanding of the solar system would never be the same again. In the winter of 1609, after refining the lenses of his telescope, Galileo used it to observe the moon and the planets of the solar system. With the new telescope, he was able to make out things which no human being had ever seen before, and soon began writing these up into a book which he entitled Sidereus Nuncius, or Starry Messenger. It was published in March 1610, and was a relatively short book of about 60 pages in the original, with engravings and drawings included. One of these was of Galileo's observations of the surface of the moon. He was the first individual to adduce that the different shades on the lunar surface were owing to the fact that there were, in effect, mountains on the moon, and lower-lying areas in other places. Based on his observations, he was able to estimate that these mountains were about 4 miles high, a quite accurate reading. Beyond his appraisal of the moon, the book laid out a range of other observations. Galileo informed his readers that there were many more stars than was traditionally understood to be the case. A person just needed a telescope to be able to see them. He also described what we now know concretely as the 4 largest of Jupiter's 95 moons. These are Ganymede, Callisto, Io, and Europa. Galileo noted that he had observed 3 of these initially in a straight line, and perceived them as stars near Jupiter. Further observations had led him to conclude that they were 4 moons of Jupiter near each other. The reception to Sidereus Nuncius was very pronounced for a work of natural philosophy or science at the time. Typically, such works were read by a small number of people and took decades to have a really tangible impact on society. But Galileo's revelations caused quite a stir, leading to numerous works being composed in response, and even paintings which incorporated astronomical observations. It also initiated a rush amongst astronomers elsewhere to acquire or make their own telescopes with better lenses so that they could view what Galileo had seen with their own eyes. The Pisan made a good bit of money selling his own telescopes as well, as a result. The Starry Messenger not only demonstrated Galileo's greatness as a scientist in developing his telescopes and making accurate observations of the moon's surface and other parts of the solar system, it also highlighted his capacity for a form of early modern marketing and self-promotion. Although they are now known as Ganymede, Io, Callisto, and Europa, these names for the 4 moons of Jupiter which Galileo had first reported on were actually proposed by Simon Marius, an astronomer who had independently observed the moons literally within days of Galileo doing so. It was Marius who proposed the 4 modern names based on 4 characters from Greek and Roman mythology, who were all closely connected to Zeus, the Greek name for Jupiter, the king of the gods after whom the planet was named. Galileo had actually named the 4 moons after Cosimo II de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and his 3 brothers Francesco, Carlo, and Lorenzo. He had then collectively termed them the Medician stars. It was a clever act of flattery towards a family that ruled Tuscany and who were still extremely wealthy, despite their glory days as one of the great banking houses of Europe being long behind them. Cosimo II had just succeeded as Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1609, and would go on to become a great patron of scientists and artists, like many of his forebears during the Renaissance. The Starry Messenger was also dedicated to Cosimo. Clearly, Galileo, who retained ties to his native Tuscany, was eyeing a return to Florence, a city he had lived in for some years in his youth, and where he had spent time intermittently as a tutor in later years. The publication of Sidereus Nuncius and Galileo's careful efforts to endear himself to the Medici family back in his native Tuscany quickly reaped dividends. Within months of the appearance of the book, he was appointed as chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke at the Florentine court. Therefore, after 18 years at the University of Padua, Galileo left to become a leading figure at the Medici court in Florence. Simply put, this was about money, resources, and time. His position at Padua made him a middle-class scholar, but even professorships did not pay particularly well in the early modern era, whereas, as a senior figure at the Medici court, he would have better pay, additional resources with which to carry out his research, and would be freed from the pesky task of having to teach in between carrying out his research. It was an obvious move to make. Nonetheless, it led to considerable family turmoil. Galileo brought his 2 young daughters with him to Florence and soon left them with the San Matteo convent in the city. Marina remained behind in Padua with young Vincenzo. Why is unclear, as Marina's later life is poorly documented. Perhaps she was ill, as we do know that she died 2 years later, in either her early or mid-40s. With her passing, Vincenzo came to join his father in Florence, and Galileo subsequently petitioned the Grand Duke successfully to have Vincenzo legitimized, as though he had been born in wedlock. Father and son would later quarrel over his career choice, with Galileo wishing for Vincenzo to become a lawyer rather than pursue a musical career. They fully reconciled in later years. In 1611, not long after he obtained his new position in Florence, Galileo visited the Collegio Romano in Rome. There he was admitted to the Accademia dei Lincei, an organization of natural philosophers that had been founded in the city in 1603, and which has a claim to being the oldest scientific society in the world, more than half a century older than England's Royal Society. This evinces his growing range of connections with other natural philosophers throughout Italy. It was owing to his correspondence with one such scholar that Galileo's long clash with the Catholic Church and the Roman Inquisition began. The scholar in question was Benedetto Castelli, a former student of Galileo's who held the same position of lecturer in mathematics at the University of Pisa that Galileo had himself once occupied. The pair remained friends and colleagues and would frequently write to one another. One of these letters has become infamous, the so-called Letter to Benedetto Castelli of 1613. In the early modern era, such letters between scholars were regularly written for wider distribution as treatises framed as letters. This was the case with the Letter to Benedetto Castelli. It was not published at the time, but it was copied and widely disseminated in manuscript form. In it, Galileo robustly argued against the idea that biblical scripture could be used as a rational basis for scientific argument. His reason for presenting this argument was clear. Several scholars had published work in response to the Sidereus Nuncius, in which they had questioned how the works of Galileo did not contradict the Bible. In the letter, Galileo wanted to rebut these arguments and stated that the Bible and scientific inquiry should be treated as separate, distinct issues. Faith and reason were not to be considered together. In the process, he had also defended the Copernican theory of the universe, which held that the Earth rotates around the Sun rather than the Earth being the center of the universe. It was this latter issue which would bring him into legal jeopardy before long. The letter to Benedetto Castelli soon became the basis for Galileo's first encounter with the Roman Inquisition. A copy of it was obtained in the winter of 1614.